Thank you. Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for the introduction and welcome to you all to this inaugural Leaders Series. I think it's wonderful that we have this in New Zealand. We need to have more forums to enable expressions of leadership points of view and debate about the future, not just of our industries, but the future of the country. And I therefore hope that, of course, tonight's a success, but that we can continue to see it supported well into the future. I'd like to thank AB+F and Randstad and, of course, Chapman Tripp for Dermot, for your welcome and your hosting. I think it would have been a little more awkward if we hadn't been doing this on the ANZ floor in the building, but thankfully it's Chapman Tripp. Last Monday night on ABC TV in Australia, on Q&A, I watched on the internet later a debate between Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist/agnostic, he wasn't quite sure which one he was, and Cardinal George Pell, the head of the Catholic Church in Australia. And it was a really interesting debate. As a Christian, I followed it with great intent to see, you know, the weight of the argument, although I do have a preference and a belief on that one. But during the night, they had a Twitter feed coming through all the time from the community about what they were hearing and what they were seeing. And one caught my eye. This one said, it would be, where's the devil represented in the panel? Perhaps by one of the bank CEOs, question. So tonight I stand before you and I'm going to put out for thought three themes that I want to challenge you to think about under the banner of Grow New Zealand. And the first theme is that we have an awesome potential in this country to be one of the most highly performing economies in the world. Point one. Point two, we need to have world-class leaders and world-class leadership if that is going to be achieved. And a number of those world-class leaders need to be in this very room. And the third point is that banking is a vital part for securing that growth for New Zealand to reach its potential. And I believe in the next 10 to 20 years it could indeed be one of the few industries in New Zealand that we could genuinely say is world-class. They're the three themes that I want to put before you, and I want you to think about this not in a passive way, but as if you are going to walk out of here and do something about it. So the first theme is New Zealand has amazing opportunity and amazing potential. New Zealand is, without doubt, in my mind, one of the best places in the world to live. I've lived in this country 18 years and invested a lot of my life and energy in it. Every time I travel to places around the world, great though they are, I get on an Air New Zealand plane to come back. And it's not just because my family and my friends are here and my work is here, but it's because I believe in this country there is an opportunity to do some karaoke. There is an opportunity that we have not yet realised. And I think one of the issues is ambition. Unfortunately, in this country, less so in Australia, but still there is a tall poppy syndrome. We outsource leadership and thinking to the government. And I think we need to have a willingness by people like ourselves and our work colleagues and our neighbours to think a lot more expansively about growth and the potential of New Zealand. For those who have seen that great movie, Despicable Me, a great animated movie with the villain in it, Gru. Now Gru wants to be the greatest villain of all. and he has this sort of little army of minions. You know, some of them have got one eye and some have got two, and they're like really little, cute little guys. And they work for Gru to become the greatest villain of all. So you could certainly say he's got ambition. And he's got this sort of arch enemy, I think his name's Victor, right? And anyway, he sort of gets his minions together, and he's like doing a performance review for the end of the year for Gru Incorporated, he says. And he goes, you know, we've done very well. And the minions, yeah, we've done very well. He says, but we've been beaten by, you know, Victor, who has stolen the pyramids. Right? He's stolen the pyramids out of Egypt, right? And then, so Gru says, but we've done very well as well. And he sort of goes through all the things they've achieved. And the biggest achievement, of course, was we stole a Jumbotron for Times Square. And he puts it up, this huge screen comes up. And then he talks about how he stole, or they stole, the Statue of Liberty from Vegas. It's about this big. And the Eiffel Tower. But then he says, but you know, I've got a new plan. And my plan is that we will steal the moon. With this little sort of shrink ray gun, right? So, Gru had this great ambition to do something that others hadn't done. Didn't pitch himself against others so-ran villains, but really pitched it higher. Now my question is, we don't want to steal anything, of course, certainly not the moon, but what is it that New Zealand wants? And that answer comes from its people. That answer only comes from people. And too often, a point I've earlier made, we outsource that vision and thinking to politicians, good though they are, rather than the community and business leaders and leaders generally. So I think we need to see acts of confidence and optimism and risk-taking and bigger statements of we have the ability to do some amazing things. I don't hear those conversations enough in our country about what is possible. And it needs to be people like us who start to change those conversations into possibilities, because to me, that is an act of leadership. Unfortunately, once again, this last year, in the year to February 2012, we had a net loss of 40,000 people to Australia. Now, Australia's a great country too, but my children live here, and I think my family's future and my future is here. And that is something that we need to change. Now, we need to change that by making it a place that people want to stay. So we had a blip after the GFC where that fell. It was an unusual circumstance, and it was driven probably by fear and risk tolerance, but the long-term trend has now been resumed. My view is, until we can create a country of opportunities, where there are positive, confident leaders speaking for it, and creating that vision, that number will not change. So I think we've got, the reason why we can have confidence is we've got a sound economy and good infrastructure, and we're well regulated, and we've got all a good sound government, all those things which are really important. But I think we've got some really killer apps. We've got some things that I think in the next 50 to 100 years are going to be extraordinarily important if we want to use them. So they include being on the doorstep of Australia, which is going to be a long-term growth story, and on the doorstep of the biggest growth story in the next 100 years, which is Asia. China, India, leave it to one side. Go to those smaller, high-growth economies like the Philippines and the Vietnam, and name another 10, where the middle-class growth is occurring at a rate that's astounding. There's our opportunity. To do that in a way that's not just around commodities, but it's around smart, clever, innovative solutions. Probably based around agri and food of some description. But we've got lots of other positives, like forestry and farming and tourism. Although tourism, unfortunately, tends to have more of a low-wage output. And, of course, we have an advantage which people would die for, and that's water. We have, in New Zealand, the amount of rain and snow that falls every year would fill Lake Taupo 8 times over if we started with an unfilled. Extraordinary. Fresh water becomes one of the most crucial resources that anybody could have. Now we need to do a lot more to work out what's the irrigation strategy to be able to harness that. But my point here is that we've got some assets and some resources which, quite frankly, are unbelievably good. The question is that potential going to be converted into more than what we've done in the past, certainly the past 30 years? So some amazing resources, and I think, though, 2 or 3 big issues that we need to face into. And there's quite a number. Everyone brings their own list, and I'd like to put out 2 or 3. The first is that unless we save more, and that means some deferring of consumption, some changing of some materialism drives, unless we change the tax system to incentivise longer term savings, unless we build a better, more cost-effective and efficient and transparent advice capability in the country, that savings rate will not be at a rate that we will be able to finance the growth of the economy. It will be severely constrained. And we know that we cannot keep importing capital at the rate we have. So we need to change that, but my argument is there needs to be a number of tools and levers that are pulled. And we have a role to play as leaders to talk to the community about that and to put pressure back on governments to make change, because that is how it's going to happen. So unless we change our savings rates, our economy and this potential is not going to be realised. That's one big issue. Second big issue, and it's partly a subset, is we need to get more capital to businesses. We have, at Bank of New Zealand, some wonderful clients, and I visit them regularly. It's one of the highlights of my role, to go out around New Zealand and talk to businesses that are so well run and so clever and have so much potential. These are businesses that might turn over $2 to $5 million, but could turn over 20 or 50. Now, often there's 2 problems. One, the owner doesn't have the ambition. Problem 1. Problem 2 is, if they need equity capital, where do they get it? And this is a real systemic constraint. We have some reasonable angel and venture capital funds established, maybe not been systemised enough, not been promoted enough, and certainly not tax effective enough to be able to encourage people to invest. But we need to put, I see Francesca there, from New Zealand Viv, who's doing a great job promoting the story. In fact, to borrow from Francesca, if we break this down into bite-sized pieces, over the next decade, we need $2 billion of equity capital to finance, say, $200 million a year. That is a possible number. That number would make a material difference to the viability and growth of a small-ish number, but effective number of New Zealand companies to go to export markets. So that is one area. And also reading last week, the Future Fund in Australia, I think a fund now of about $70 billion, about $4 billion of it, just over 5%, has been invested in private equity. So there's a sign of an enablement of growth. So my point here is we have a wonderful opportunity. We have amazing potential. And I see David Parker down there. We have government playing an important role, but a too important role in my view, because leaders in this country, in this room, are outsourcing too much thinking to others. And if we want this to change, we need to start to have conversations and debates like this that start to change it. That's my first point. To do that, I think we're going to need leadership, which comes to my second piece that I want to put forward. So New Zealand needs leaders because we're going to have to innovate and create and adapt and take risks to grow. And that is not a management exercise. Because management is, managing constraints efficiently, getting goals, governing well, all that's needed. But leadership is about changing the game and changing the trajectory and finding potential that you can't see and can't even prove and investing in it to make it work. That's leadership. So leadership is a much higher bar if you want to be a leader. And I think we need leaders in New Zealand more like that, who can create the voice of change. So I think we need CEOs in this country, the hundreds that we have, public, private, not-for-profits, to feel an obligation to start to have leadership conversations with their boards, with their workforce, with their community, with all their stakeholders, with the media, with the government, and start to create a picture of a different New Zealand than what we are thinking of today. In fact, it may not be unreasonable to think of why we shouldn't have a New Zealand, a 20-year strategic plan. That should be possible in this country with just over 4 million people. Where the basic elements, the 80-20, the 80's agreed by all, and different people have views about different times, including governments, about where the emphasis should need to be, or maybe where the beneficiaries are. But I think that could be an interesting challenge, to work out what should be a 20-year New Zealand strategic plan that people sign up for. But I think the role of leaders is not just to think, but to engage and start to act differently, which to me is to have forums like this. I see Roger Partridge here, to forums like the New Zealand Initiative, for people to get involved and have a view and present a different idea, but we cannot be passive about it. We've got to sell it. You've got to communicate it. To effect change, we need to change our own companies. And we need to not take no for an answer, or when we get pushback, we've got to keep going, because if you want a different country, leaders dig in, believe in the future, and keep negotiating. So, that's hard work. I think we certainly need more leadership at sort of medium enterprise level. We've had a 10-year relationship with Icehouse, which does some fantastic work around growth programs, about skilling those same companies I mentioned, $2 to $5 million, how to write financial plans, marketing plans, risk plans, to get the right governance, the right capital structures. We need to get more people through those. But my final point here is that leadership is an act. Leadership is an act that everyone can do. The highest bar of role modelling of leadership goes to people in this room and people like CEOs who have the title and authority that demands it. But everybody is a leader, because leadership is an act of being decisive, of being courageous, of taking a risk, of being prepared to have a difficult conversation with somebody that you do not want to have a difficult conversation with. Somebody in your organisation who's 2 levels above you. That to me is leadership, and that is available to everybody. So we talk about, in BNZ, about everyone's a leader. 5,000 people thinking about changing our position, strengthening our positions, bringing up new ideas, taking risks and changing things. And to me, that's the sort of model we need to build into New Zealand. So don't look at each other. Don't look at me. We've all got to look in the mirror. So, to me here, this piece around, if we want to be a great country, realise the potential I made in point 1, leadership's going to be vital. There's not enough of it. We outsource it. But the main point here is that leadership is an act that is open and available to all. Point 3, banking. Now, banking to me is going to be vital if the potential for New Zealand is going to be realised. And I think in this country we have a very good, very strong banking sector. It's efficient, it functions well, it's well regulated, it's well governed. I think what I would call the basics of banking are important in New Zealand banks. They're taken seriously, so things like risk management, operational risk, all those sorts of things are important in our banks, and that's a really good thing. So we've got a really good, sound banking system, and we need to try to have a more rational debate around some of these things, as per the Twitter, about the devil's representatives, because I know that we need to change that debate, and we need to change some things in the banks. There's no doubt about that, that we need to change more to make things simpler and fairer and in plain English, etc. We need to do that. But the fundamentals all point to a very sound, well-run industry that creates jobs, that takes money from savers and efficiently allocates capital, that enables almost 1 billion transactions a year to move around the payment system, by and large, without any problem. At last count, and I chair one of DAB's subsidiaries in the US called Great Western Bank, which is based in that great place, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, right in the Midwest. At last count, 758 banks in the US required taxpayer funding. In New Zealand, that number is 0. And that's because of all the other things I mentioned. But what we've got is some serious challenges. I mentioned some reputation challenge, or I touched on them. We've certainly got some funding challenges. We cannot afford to be the vehicle that imports more and more capital. The Reserve Bank, Basel committees, and even our own common sense and experience is telling us that we need to change that. So there's definitely funding constraints that we need to face into and keep dealing with. And we've got a lot of compliance and regulation coming down the pipe. Basel III, the Open Bank Resolution from the Reserve Bank, FATCA, great name that one, and AML and counter finance terrorism. So, you know, there's a lot of regulation. Now, I think we need to be a little more commercial about those in their fullness and those in their timing, because we're coming from a pretty good base. But if we're going to be a serious banking industry, which we are, if we're going to fund overseas, we need to do things like apply Basel rules. There's no question about that. But I do think one thing we could do is harmonise a number of our regulations and compliance obligations, if at all possible, with Australia. Especially as most of the large banks here have Australian parents. So, my final point on this one though is, because I'm building a case here, is that the banking system's working well, it's really critical for the economy, we've got some challenges in it, including some own goals that we've kicked in the last 5-10 years in the industry, but to me it needs to be more than that. I think banking could be one of the world-class industries in New Zealand. I think it has that potential to be an industry sector that innovates and builds a transparency and a respect with the community and a respect from government and regulators and customers and staff that is the envy of any other bank and banking system in the world. But we need to pitch ourselves not against our peers, maybe not, certainly not feeling inferior to our Australian parents or banks in Australia. We need to pitch ourselves against the best in the world and say they're the sort of numbers and system and efficiencies and programs that the best banks have, and that's where we need to pitch ourselves. Because then we're starting to say we're in a serious league of being amongst the best banks, not just in New Zealand, Australia, but potentially around the world. So, I think banking needs to leverage and create more opportunities, it needs to change itself, it needs to earn more respect, and it needs to continue to be an industry that is one that does ensure best practice is applied, and I think in this country that is indeed the case. So, in closing, I want to say that my 3 points are that we have great potential. Whether that is realised is up to us. Second, we need a world-class leadership model, world-class system and world-class leaders. And thirdly, we've got a very good banking system. It could be great, and we should put the ante on ourselves to say we want to be amongst the best in the world sustainably as a banking industry. But finally, so what? Now what? And I heard recently wise counsel from an Indigenous Hawaiian elder who said the following: you cannot think your way into a new way of acting. You must act your way into a new way of thinking. And that struck a chord with me, because like me, you're probably analytical, thoughtful, considered, assess risks, get equations, all that sort of stuff, and we need that. But this says actually leadership is about starting to do something different, starting to be someone different, starting to act differently, not next month, tomorrow. Starting to look into our own mirror and say, what is the sort of leader I want to be, and therefore what are the behaviours that I need to exhibit? And as I act that out, I get confidence. I see the results. I start to believe more in myself and those around me, and it reinforces itself. So on the note of, you can't think yourself into a new way of acting, you must act yourself into a new way of thinking. I thank you for being here, and I invite you to do the very thing when you go back to work tomorrow. Thank you very much.